So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out for another Brightspace inFocus session. The topic for today's exploration, if you will, we're going to have a look at the quiz tool in Brightspace a little bit. And it is a great time to be doing this because we're in a live session. We've got quizzes that were run in the last session. We've got people that are getting students in doing quizzes now. So we can really have a look at this front to back, really. So what I'd like to start doing is having a look at um, where some of those quizzes are up to in the current teaching session. And then I'm actually going to work back through the process of building one so we can get some questions happening at that point as well. As with these sessions, time permitting, once we've finished looking at the quiz tool, I'm happy to take any of your questions, etc., on just about anything in Brightspace. But let's begin by having a look at the quiz tool. And I'm joined by Kelly Boone from the project team as well today, and Kel will be helping with any of your questions going into the chat, etc. And I'll stop periodically where you need me to. So I thought I would begin today by looking at the Brightspace homepage, because in this, I guess, new interface that we have, one part of that is this My Subjects widget that you'll have waiting for you with this thumbnail view of subjects that you have access to. And the icons, the use of icons to represent student activity going on. Now, in the context of the quiz tool, we have this little question mark icon, which starts to give us information around numbers of attempts going on with things like discussion tools, assignment tools. The question mark indicates attempts on quizzes. And I think that's quite valuable if we're looking to know when students are doing quizzes, etc. And I was actually jumping into some earlier. So I can see here, for example, in this microbiology subject that's going on, that we've got basically over 100 attempts at quizzes. So I'm quite curious about that. If I'll open up the subject in a separate tab. We'll go in there in a second. But if I click on that icon by itself, it'll jump straight to the Manage Quiz dashboard inside the subject. So we've got a shortcut right there that will take us directly to quiz attempts going on. And if I open this up, I can see what looks to be a series of quizzes. Some of them look to be, let's say, student facing or don't require evaluation, perhaps. They are linked to the gradebook. I can see that they've been restricted to particular cohorts in this case. They've also got availability conditions, so they're becoming visible to students at a certain point and disappearing at a certain point. So in this case, this one had a due date of the 12th of July. They could do up until that point in time, and then it disappeared. So students were no longer able to see the portal, with the caveat being if they had have used special access or extensions, it would have made some students get extended access at that point. But we had hundreds of students doing this quiz. So I'm kind of interested to have a look at it, really. The best way to get a look at a quiz is to hit the drop down next to it, and we can go to grade. And at that point, it's going to open up our view of submissions. And it's interesting that each of these dashboards looks a little different depending on the tool that we're viewing them through. The assignment dashboard has some similarities, but it also has some differences. With the quiz view, when we get into our submission view, you can see that I'm able to have a look at all of the users in the subject, whether they've done a quiz or not. And it'll show me the various attempts made by the students, scoring, etc. I can see the schema that's in place here, so the result the student would have received at the end. And I can see multiple attempts, and there, in this case, it's telling me the highest attempt is what's being recorded. So that tells me a little bit about how the quiz has been set up. If we actually go into the second tab, which is the attempts view, I can see at this point attempt 1, attempt 2, etc. against individual students. I can change my view at that point, change the filter to show only particular cohorts. Now, this would be relevant if you had multiple cohorts all using the same shared portal. So we have some subjects where people have set up separate quiz links for different cohorts of students. So this one was restricted. I have a feeling that it may have been for, if I chose orange internal, let's have a look. Nope, no one in orange internal. What about Wagga distance? Nope. So that's telling me that in this case, this particular quiz was probably set up for Wagga internal. So the actual filtering or viewing by sections, when you've already created a quiz that was restricted to one cohort. So if we go back and have a look at this, it does say right there that it's been restricted. If I edit this quiz and actually go and have a look at our availability dates, we can see here that it has been restricted to Wagga internal. And when we're actually going through our grading, etc., this view by sections is only of value to us if we're using a common portal. Otherwise, it's already been restricted. So if I was to look at all the students, it's only going to show me the ones that have done this, and the ones that were that this has been made available to is Wagga internal. So that might give you something to think about in terms of whether you're using separate submission portals for every cohort or a common portal for everybody. If you're using one for everyone to use, then this filtering will allow you to shift between cohorts. So there's kind of two ways to look at it. Either create a separate portal for every cohort or a common portal and use your view by to filter between your views. You'll notice that we also have the option here of changing to a view by question. And at that point, we can actually look at responses to particular questions without going through the rest of the quiz. So if I wanted to see the student response to question 25, for example, it's going to open that up. And in this case, which student is it showing me? Elizabeth Gibson at the top. She chose that answer. It's correct. If I moved between the next response, which would be the same student, but her response to the next question. So I haven't quite figured out yet whether I am interested in using that view at an individual student level. I'd like to get a view of questions where the whole I was getting stats on the whole cohort's response to a particular question. But I just find that quite interesting that when we look at our quiz dashboard, manage quizzes, it gives us a number of options when we're in our grade view. You may never use more than just the first one. Anyway, let's have a look at the results that have come in for this quiz. I'll go into grade, looking at the dashboard. I'm going to open up the student attempt, which looks like the last one for this student was a second attempt. They got 8 out of 10 this time instead of 7.5. We open it up and we start getting details around their attempt. So the timestamp, when they did it, how long they spent doing it, 20 minutes. They got 8 out of 10. The system equated that to being a distinction. They got no feedback on the overall attempt. So this tells me that it probably was automated. And then we can see correct. They're getting a half mark each for each of these responses. Correct, correct. Keep working through. I'm looking for an incorrect one. Here we go. Student response, correct response. Any feedback provided against each of these questions? No. Incorrect from the student, correct response. In some cases, they've used images here to choose between in their quiz questions. So in a lot of ways, the quiz tool itself in Brightspace is very similar to what we had access to in the test center in Blackboard, functionality-wise. You'll notice down in the bottom right-hand corner, I've got two options currently. One is to update if I wanted to change the score that the student received. That would then flow through to the gradebook and they would get a notification email with their new updated score. Or I can retract. And retract would mean unpublish, remove the score from the gradebook, effectively bring it back into a draft mark view where it would wait for someone to actually hit the publish button again. So be aware of the differences between retracting and updating. One of them just gives the student a new score. The other one actually removes it from my grades altogether. So that's kind of the end result that we're getting from the quiz tool itself with an automatically published quiz that required no evaluator input, so to speak. So automatically marking. Let me stop there and see if we've got any questions at that point on what we just looked at or comments. Anything that anyone would like to get into a little bit more on that front?
Hi, Lachlan. It's Liz here.
Hey, Liz.
Just about that retract button,
Mm.
actually, is that so if only can Marcus wouldn't necessarily have access to that, would they? I'm just thinking potential to go pear-shaped. You don't want to remove it from the whole grade book, do
It's
you?
got to do with who has publishing rights.
Yeah.
So by default, in Brightspace, anyone who can mark can publish. So I think this will become a little bit more clear when I start creating a quiz in a second. We'll see the difference
Yeah.
between
Okay, cool. Sorry.
evaluator settings. No, you're absolutely right to ask, but by default, both publish and save as draft, and then after publishing, update and retract are available to all markers.
Yeah, ready.
All right, so it's a really good point. I think it's quite interesting to see as well, looking at this view of when publishing happened. And I can see here, publishing happened on the 10th of July here. Here it happened on the 1st. Here it happened on the 5th and the 9th. All these different dates tell me that this is automatically publishing when the student makes their attempt, rather than a convener, for example, choosing a particular date and time and saying publish all. Because if that was the case, they would all have the same timestamp for when they were published. So just bits and pieces that we can pick up from the dashboard. You'll notice as well with the quiz tool that we've got above the dashboard, we've got the opportunity to export the quiz results and the questions. So if you're ever in a position where you need that data, so a prime example is when people want to upload quiz responses into something like Turnitin, you would be exporting the quiz information to Excel from here and then batch uploading it to Turnitin. But that is a whole separate lunchtime talk. The functionality is certainly there. All right. I think what I'm going to do is build a quiz from scratch in my training site, and that may give us some other questions to get into. We've looked at the end result for an automatically marked and published quiz. What I want to get into is building one from scratch. All right, so I'm in the training site, and where I want to start this process is I have a bank of questions that happen to be in another site, and I want to bring them into my site so I can use them for the quiz. So the first thing I'm going to do here is go into my subject admin area. I'm going to use the import export copy components tool. And the one I want to focus on is copying from another subject in Brightspace. So that's the first option, copy components. I happen to have some in my training site. You guys would just need the subject code. In this case, I'm just going to put in the word training and see what it gives me. Oh my goodness, way too much. Let me find the actual name of my training site. Might be easier for me. So it's called SB_training. Let's go with that. Search for this and go with SB_training. That's better. And here's my master site. I'm going to copy from that site. So you always start in the destination where you want the content and find where the content lives currently. And then it's asking, do I want to bring everything from that site? I really don't. So I'm going to go into select components. I'm after something that is not content this time around. I'm after a quiz question library. So here's my option to bring the entire question library, which has 52 questions in it. And I could either bring individual questions across or all of them. I want that whole question library. So I'm going to hit continue. I'm not interested in offset dates. I'm going to finish this process. It's now going to copy that from the master site into my current site. This process is generally very quick. Says me, and now I'll be proven wrong. There we go. So it's now there. It's in my question library in my new site that I'm in. So I'm going to now go through the process of building a quiz. If I go into my assessment menu, quizzes and exams, I'm now going to build a new quiz. But before I do that, let's have a look at that question library just to make sure that it's got all that new stuff in it. So I can go into the question library tab at the top. And there are the 3 folders that came from my master site. So they have a bunch of questions in them. So that's good. I'm done with looking at the question library. So let's build a new quiz. When we go to build a new quiz, we're given the same type of layout as we have with our assignment tool, with a couple of exceptions, but effectively our customization of the quiz happens on the right-hand side. Our question library and adding questions to the quiz happen at the bottom. And at the top, we have the same things that it's asking us for. So a title for the quiz. So I'd probably start with trying to identify the assessment number. Maybe a title for the quiz. And if it was required for a particular cohort, I would identify the cohort in here as well. It just makes it easier for me to link this, to identify this, to find out what it's for, when it's for. Try and include that type of information in the quiz. We'll notice at the moment that it says grade out of 0, and I can't do anything about that until I start adding questions. So the quiz tool actually wants scoring information after you start adding questions. It bases that on the questions that you add to the quiz. If we were building a quiz shell, I'd be saying to you, don't put in a due date, don't link it to the gradebook. But we're in an actual teaching site at the moment, so I'll deal with that in just a moment. Instructions for the quiz. And before I start adding questions, I'm now going to customize how I want this quiz to operate. Availability dates and conditions. We're going to be talking about a due date for the quiz, which effectively for most people will be the point up until students cannot take the quiz. So it's the end point. Start date and end date refer to the visibility of the actual submission portal. So if I was going to say that this quiz will end up being due, let's say the students can have until Sunday midnight to do the quiz. Start date and end date refer to when they're going to be able to see the link to do the quiz. If I only want them to be able to do it from this week, for example, if I was saying, oh, let's set this up for next week. I'm going to say you get access to it from Monday morning. By default, it'll start at 1 minute past midnight. I'm going to change the due date, in fact, so it's at the end of next week, so the 28th. And I'm going to make the end date the same as the due date because I don't want students going back into that quiz tool afterwards and doing more attempts. There's no other way to restrict them being able to do this quiz other than to remove the visibility of the actual submission portal. So I'm going to set the end date the same as the due date. At that point, they're not going to be able to get in and do this quiz after the due date unless I give them an extension. Do I want the availability dates to be listed in the student calendar? Yes, I do. And that's probably about all I'm interested in putting in unless I was going to restrict this to a particular cohort. If this quiz portal was only going to be for Bathurst distance students, for example, I'd be adding in a release condition, creating a new one, which is going to be a class list section enrollment. Hopefully by now, each of you has had a chance to play around with release conditions in some form or another, but I'm going to create a section enrollment, class list, Bathurst distance, and now only those students will be able to see this, which probably means I'd be updating the title up here somewhere. That's all I need to worry about in terms of my availability dates. Then we get into our timing settings. How long did we get for the quiz? I'm going to say 30 minutes. By default, the way the quiz behaves is that the timer will start the moment that you open the quiz. And then when the time is up, it will automatically submit. That's the default behavior of the quiz. Now, unless you want to change that, you'll be leaving that as it is. The options that we get under timer settings are things like you set a due date and time, and the actual timer will end up commencing at that point. So it's like an exam condition. If I say, well, it starts at 1 o'clock tomorrow and you get 30 minutes, it means for everybody, the timer starts at 1 o'clock tomorrow and it will auto submit when we hit the end of that. So that's probably something quite specific for something like an exam. When it finishes, what happens? Well, automatically it's going to submit, unless you change it to something like, oh, it's going to tell me that they exceeded the time limit, but they can keep going. I don't know whether that's an option that we would ever select, but maybe. And then the last one says, well, we don't do anything. We don't enforce the time limit. So again, I'm not sure about either of those last two options, but maybe you've got a scenario where that would apply. I'll leave those as they are. How do I want my questions to appear? All on the same page. So just scrolling from the first question through to the last, 1 on each page, 5 on each page, 10 on each page, or do I actually want to put in page breaks between sections? And when we talk about sections in the quiz tool, it actually literally means section this time, not cohort, not anything else. It means a part of the quiz that might be part A, where we maybe have a series of multiple choice questions. And then maybe part B is open response questions, and part C is something else. You can create distinct areas within your quiz for different types of activity. I'll show you how to do that when we add our questions. At this point, I'm going to add in a page break between each of my sections. Backtracking, do you want to stop them going back to a previous part? I'm not sure why you would do that, but maybe. Shuffling of questions. This is always an interesting one, I guess, in the context of these days when we're talking about academic integrity and getting the best chance at the actual student having a genuine attempt rather than trying to cheat, for example. People talk about shuffling potentially as being a bit outdated because what we want is a pool of questions and we're getting a random selection every time. If we use pools and random selection, we don't need shuffling. You would use shuffling when you had the same 10 questions, and maybe I'm thinking, if I make Liz do questions 8, 2, 4, 6, 1, 10, it somehow gives us a better chance of her not cheating than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's still the same 10 questions. So I don't really know that shuffling gives us much of a bonus. Then it asks about hints, disabling those, etc. I don't really mess around with any of these settings that are in here, to be honest. I don't know that they offer me much. So that's it for timing and display. Then we get into attempts and completion. How many attempts at the quiz? Now, the one we looked at a minute ago allowed students to do unlimited attempts up to a certain point. So we would be changing one attempt to unlimited in that case. Maybe there's 1, maybe there's 2, that's up to you. But you basically can go 1 through 10 or unlimited. I'm going to let the students have 2 attempts at this quiz, and I'm going to then let them take the highest attempt. That will give us the same condition as the quiz that we saw a minute ago. When they're doing new attempts, do I want them only have to answer questions that they got incorrect previously? That's an interesting option. Maybe. It's up to you. You can add other attempt conditions in. And at that point, you're starting to really talk about they have to have scored between a particular range to then give them access to a subsequent attempt. So I don't know if I want to get into that level of complexity, but you could set that up. It's just another type of release condition. At this point, I'm just going to hit OK. I think I will only make them do the ones they got wrong. Hit OK. Now, where it talks about category here, it's asking if you want to set up sections on your quiz dashboard to organize the different quizzes. So it's the same as the assignment tool. You're setting up subheadings on your dashboard to organize different quiz attempts. I'm not doing that in this case. And lastly, do I want to be notified every time a student submits a quiz? I don't personally, maybe you would. All right, so we've done the first 3. That then leaves us with evaluation and feedback settings. By default, auto-publish the results as soon as they finish. So this has value to us, I suppose, with those self-marking quizzes. But if we auto-publish, it means on the spot, the student gets access to their score and none of the actual question answers or responses. They just get a score. This is the default behavior of the quiz tool. So if there are no open response questions or ones that need marking, or an evaluator's input. They're going to get their score on the spot. You'll notice that by default, grayed out here, it says synchronized to the gradebook. So that means not only will I get a message on the screen as soon as I finish the quiz saying, Lachlan, you got 7 out of 10, it would also go straight through to the gradebook. If you want that to change, you need to uncheck the first box, and then we can start getting into details around synchronizing and when that's going to happen in just a moment. I think that will require us to add questions before it will start letting me change how it's going to behave, because it's looking for a grade. Before I can start talking about the gradebook, it wants this information to be populated. So I'm going to actually come back to my evaluation settings once I start adding questions in. All right, let's have a look at the question section. At the moment, I have no questions in my quiz. So what I want to do is create a series of pools for my quiz. If you use Add Existing, it's going to ask you to start adding questions one by one into your question list. And to be honest, I'm not really wanting to do that. I want to create pools first, and then I'm going to add questions within those pools. So I'm going to go across to Create New, and my options are a question from scratch, where you would get to choose the type of question, etc. Create a new section. So maybe I'll create some sections first. Sections in the quiz. I'm going to call this Part 1. Whoops, Part 1. I'm going to hit Save. And I'll create another section. I'm going to call it Part 2. You don't have to do this. I'm just demonstrating the functionality of it. This is just a way for me to organize where my questions are going to live. That'll do. I'll put 2 in for now. Now I'm going to create a pool. So I'm going to have a series of questions. Maybe I'll call this Assessment 1 Quiz Pool for Part 1. Part 1's going to have 5 questions in it. At the moment, there are none for it to choose from, but each question is going to give us 1 mark. And now I can find my questions. So I want you to pull Part 1 from this folder. I can either open up the folder and choose the individual questions, or check at the top and it will pull all of the questions. So there are 12 in that folder. That'll do. So it's now pulling 5 questions randomly from a pool of 12 with 1 mark for each. That's fine. Hit save. I now have that pool there. What I want to do is make that pool part of Part 1. And by dragging it like I did there with the handlebars, this now happens within Section 1. And if you remember, when I was setting up my timing and display settings, I said, I want you to put in a page break separating each section. It will mean the students will be dealing with Part 1 first, and then they move into Part 2, and they're going to have a second series of questions. So now I'm going to create a whole new pool for Part 2. Again, I'm going to use that same labeling I did before. Assessment 1. We'll call it Assessment 1 Quiz Pool. And this is for Section 2. And this time round, I want 10 questions with 1 point per question. And I'm going to browse for my library. And this time round, I want it to pull questions from these 2 folders. So there are 37 questions that are inside those 2 folders. Bring those in. 10 from 37 worth 1 each. Hit save. So I now have 5 questions here, 10 questions here, giving us 15 points. And you'll notice that the grade area has automatically been populated at this point. So we have our quiz set up. The second set of questions I haven't yet dragged into a section. So I'm just going to drag it so it touches on top of section here. So I've now got Part 1, Part 2. It's giving me 15 points. All of that looks okay at the moment. Now I want to have a look at where this is going to go in terms of the gradebook. So either you're linking it to an existing column in the gradebook or adding a whole new column by itself. I'm just going to add this one by itself. And you'll see now it's giving me the option to change the value up here. This is really interesting because if the value of this task in the subject outline is different to what this score is, so if I said, actually, this particular quiz is only worth 5% of the students' marks, I can change this. If I wanted to change this to 5, what it's now going to do is convert the student's score out of 15 into this actual value as it stands, for example, within the subject outline. So we get the chance to modify that so that one will be converted to the other if they're not the same value. So that's interesting. You'll notice that me changing that has now opened up these options here on the right-hand side. So I can now decide, when I publish my scores for the students, do I want it to go into the gradebook, or do I want to have to manually select publish all? That's what this synchronize option does. Do I want the students to immediately get those results published when they finish? So maybe. And when it is published, what do I want the students to see? Their score, all the questions? I kind of like some of these options, to be honest. I'm thinking what I want is, I want the result to get published to the gradebook. I'm happy for it to be synchronized, but when they get it straight away, I don't want them to get all the quiz, the answers, so to speak, just the score. Because now I can engage with this section underneath that talks about customizing the quiz results. When I open this up, it will let me create additional views for the students, and these conditions are quite interesting. At the moment, they initially get their score and nothing else. But what I'm going to do is, in fact, change and add an additional view that's going to kick in after the quiz due date has finished. So what I'm thinking of here is, when we hit that end date and due date, the 28th, I want you to release something to the student that is going to show them all of the questions, or maybe they're incorrect responses. It's up to you to choose these responses, but I don't want them to get those quiz responses as soon as they get their score. I just want them to get their score until I'm sure that everyone has taken the quiz. Then I'm happy to give them the quiz results. So at that point, I'm going to let them get, in this case, all the questions. We can get some discretion over whether or not they're seeing correct questions, correct answers to displayed questions, just showing their responses to those questions, for example, like you get the same choices there. So I find that quite interesting. I'm going to hit create. I'm going to hit OK. So this will give two different releases to the students, score, and then when we hit the due date, then they can get the question information. And at that point, I can save and close. It's still not visible to students yet, so maybe I make it visible, but I can hit save and close, and that quiz is now ready. So we have looked at quite a few things there. We've got a quiz that's coming out for these students. It's already open to them. No, it becomes available to them on the 22nd of July. They have a week, then it closes off. When they complete the quiz, it's going to give them their score, but until that due date, they're not going to get any other information from the quiz. These icons tell me that it's been restricted to a particular cohort and that it's connected to the gradebook. So all of that's pretty good, I think, in terms of our quiz setup. Let me stop there and see if I've lost all of you at that point, or if we have questions. Jackie's saying, will they see the quiz but not access, or not see it at all? That's a really good question, Jackie. So the question with the quiz tool is the visibility. If we edit the quiz again, in the assignment tool, we have options underneath start and end date around visibility, which means that we have the option of deciding if they can see the link or not see the link or see the description. For example, you don't get those options with the quiz tool. What it means is that they will see nothing until the start date, and that's it. So it is quite different to an assignment when we have some control over visibility with our start and end dates. It's interesting that they operate differently, But yeah, I think you know what I'm talking about there with the assignment tool, the fact that it gives that customization of what visibility looks like. It doesn't give you that in the quiz tool. It's either visible or not visible. And in this case, they're not going to see it until the 22nd. And that's it. Notice that we did get the option to add the information around whether or not it was going to be in the calendar. So they'll get a reminder in the calendar 2 days before saying this quiz will start becoming available to you. So that'll happen on the 20th. But in terms of the student being able to see the item in the quiz dashboard, they're not going to until the 22nd. It's a great question. So I am drifting over time as I have a tendency to do. I'm inclined probably to show you the preview function with the quiz here so we can see how it looks to students. But after that, I'll stop the recording and see who wants to ask more questions around it. If we hit our drop down, you've got two options you're probably going to be looking at most here. One of them is the grade option I looked at before to look at student attempts. The other one is preview. And the preview option will let us effectively take the quiz to see how it looks and behaves for students. So that includes the description, the timestamp information, etc., the instructions. Hit start. And you can see here the pages as they display to students. So at the moment, we've got the first page, which is our first section of the quiz. And we can take those responses and go, yeah, that. It's given me one of two pages. The second page is our second section. We can hit next page, 30 minutes. There's my timer at the top counting down. And then there were 10 questions in the second part. Let's try submitting this without having answered all the questions. Hit submit, 11 of 15. It's telling me you've still got 4 you haven't done. Do you really want to submit? Or do you want to go back to your questions? Well, I'm going to submit at this point. Now, do I want this preview attempt to be graded? Well, that's interesting. That's something particularly for markers and conveners if you want to actually grade the quiz. Why not? Let's submit. At this point, the student gets the result of their attempt. Remember, we said you get the score and no questions. That's what we're getting, automatically published. So I got 26% at that point, and I can hit exit preview. All right, so there's our lightning tour of creating a quiz, getting questions into the question library, using sections, having a look at what the preview looks like. I'll stop the recording there, but I'm happy to talk about this with anyone here from now if you've got other questions.